Good evening and welcome to our special council meeting of Wednesday, December 15th, 2021. First item under 1.1 is conflict of interest declaration, pecuniary or non-pecuniary. Is there any in the room? Seeing none. Moving down the agenda, we're going to special council meeting of agenda December 15th. Could I get a motion to adopt the agenda as presented? Council Pickering, any discussion? All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. Moving down to new business item 8.1, 2022 budget deliberations presented by our CFO, Kyle. Go ahead, Kyle, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, and good evening, everybody, to our second budget meeting. So, the intention of this budget meeting is to first essentially talk about our operating budget. So to start, I'm going to go through a few comparisons of our municipal revenue streams, that being taxes, utility rates, and franchise fees. Talk about where the town of Koldale is and how do we compare it to our neighbors and comparable municipalities. Following that, we will go through the draft operating budget, highlighted by the various requests from the departments. Just a reminder, council, that no formal approval is required from this council meeting. We are just presenting a draft budget for council's review and consideration at this meeting. There's three main revenue streams that council has the ability to adjust rates for, which are essentially charged back to the residents and ratepayers of the town of Koldale. The first being municipal property taxes, utility rates, and franchise fees. Just a reminder that when a resident or business does get their tax bill, the town of Koldale is only able to essentially control a portion of that tax bill, approximately 3/4 of it. The government of Alberta does issue requisitions for education and seniors housing, which is out of town council's control. Utility rates is essentially a user pay system. So for the town of Koldale, we have water, storm, sewer, and waste collection. Our waste collection is expanded to include compost and recycling. So it's a user pay system for this service. And the last one being franchise fees, for which municipalities can collect from the electrical and natural gas utility rates. So we start with municipal property taxes. Property taxes are essentially can be calculated by taking two steps. The first is the assessed value of your property. The assessed value of a property is determined by, for the town of Koldale, that's Benchmark Assessment Service. They are a contracted firm which does all the property assessment for the town of Koldale. They are a arm's length party from the town of Koldale. Once that assessment value of a property is determined, it's multiplied by the tax rate which town council does set. Multiplying the two together will get a resident or a business's tax bill for the year. So essentially, for the town of Koldale, when we're looking at rates, put this in comparison, for every $100,000 of assessed value you have on your house or your business, you're paying right now about $800 in municipal property taxes. Again, that is municipal property taxes, and that does exclude the education portion and the seniors portion as requisitioned by the government of Alberta. So the first step in establishing the property tax rate is part of these meetings is that council will have to approve an operating budget, which will determine the amount of taxes that's required to balance the budget. Once this is completed, the next step is the completion of the property assessment, which will be done in the new year, usually February, March. Once that's completed, town council will then be responsible for setting the municipal tax rate for the year, which will again essentially balance the operating budget for the year. So the final step of this, setting the municipal tax rate, doesn't usually occur until April of May of the next year. So while we're setting the budget for this year, setting the tax rate won't be finalized or brought forward to council till April or May of 2022. Part of setting tax rates, town council can set different tax rates for residential and non-residential properties. when we're doing this, it's important for council to consider kind of a tax strategy or split between the two. Under the Municipal Government Act, a municipality is allowed of a maximum of a 5-to-1 non-residential to residential tax rate. But speaking in more practical terms, a ratio of say 1.5 to 1 is generally more practical or feasible. Again, that's not to be determined at this meeting, but just kind of a little background or context on property taxes. So where is Koldale sitting versus kind of our neighbors and our comparables? So the municipalities that are on this list have been selected either to their close proximity to the town of Koldale, or that the population of the municipality is similar to Koldale. So in looking at the residential rate, you can see Koldale is just over 8 points there. Again, that's meaning for every $100,000 of property assessment, it's about 800 in municipal taxes. Looking at the residential level, you can see Koldale's, probably about average compared to the comparables there. Non-residential taxes, so this is the tax rate on businesses, industrial, commercial, non-linear. Town of Koldale is more at the bottom end here, which means we do have a lower tax rate compared to others. This tax rate is just under 10 points, so 9.9. So again, for a business that has an assessed property of, for every $100,000, that's about $992 in municipal tax rates. So going over this third column here, this kind of gets back to that tax strategy I just touched on. Under the Municipal Government Act, again, the highest is 5-to-1 that you're allowed. Often cities such as Calgary or Vancouver, Edmonton, they are closer to that range. You can see even Lethbridge is a, 100,000 population is about 2.5 there, but realistically speaking, practical sense would be more about 1.5. So in either, for the town of Koldale will get that ratio up. Essentially your non-residential rate would have to increase at a higher pace than the residential tax rate. Looking at the comparables here too, that's not a unreasonable proposition here too, is, if you look at where Koldale is on the residential rate compared to others versus on non-residential, which is much lower on average compared to other municipalities in this range. Part of the draft operating budget too is property tax revenue can grow from an increase in mill rate set by council, but again, we also do budget for new assessment growth. So as new houses are built, new businesses are built, and renovated or constructed, their assessment value does go up. That's not a tax increase, that's simply new assessment in revenue to the town of Koldale. So what we do is we work with our assessment company Benchmark to estimate what that figure will be. For 2022, we're estimating approximately $140,000 in new property tax assessment. So again, just kind of putting these rates in the context, a 1% increase in residential property taxes is about a $8 increase for every $100,000 for a residential parcel, and that equates to $73,000 in revenue for the town of Koldale. Looking at the non-residential side, 1% increase is about $14,000 in increased revenue, and probably $10 increase for every $100,000 in assessed value. So combining those together, a 1% increase overall is essentially $87,000 on average in revenue for the town of Koldale. Any questions on property taxes there?
Go ahead, Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. Is there a breakdown also from an earlier presentation about commercial? So you have residential, non-residential, and then you have a commercial rate as well?
So the commercial rate would be the non-residential rate. Commercial and industrial can be assessed as different property classes, but they both fall under the non-residential rate. Moving on to the second revenue stream. So talking about municipal utilities as essentially a user pay system. So Koldale does have a kind of a split structured. We do have monthly flat fees for some services, followed by consumption charges, so water and sewer. So the more water you use, the higher your utility bill will be. I'm putting that in kind of on paper here. So what we did was estimated the utility rates based on 20 cubic meters of water used versus 10 cubic meters. So, 20 cubic meters of water is quite a large amount of water to be used in an average month. So again, as you use more demand, use more water, residents can expect to pay more in their utility rates. And looking at the utility rates here, you can see Koldale still kind of is in that middle average category. We're not at the low ends, but we're definitely not close to the top end here. Part of this too, it's also important to consider Koldale's expanded waste services. Some municipalities, may not have compost or recycling like Koldale does. So, for example, you look at Blackfalds, which is at the top of this list. They don't have the compost program like the town of Koldale does as well. So, essentially, residents in town of Koldale are paying less for their utility rates, but getting more service from that as well. On average, a 1% increase in total utility revenue is about $40,000 in annual municipal revenue for budgeting purposes. Any questions on utility rates before we proceed?
Nope.
Third and final stream that we're going to touch on is franchise fees. So franchise fees are essentially a rate that is set by town council that is added to the electrical and natural gas utility bill for residents within town. So these are collected by the distributor, so Fortis and ATCO, and it's passed back to the municipality. Part of the 2022 operating budget, the previous town council did approve a 2% increase in the franchise fees rates. This is done effective January 1st. This approval was done last year because it does take multiple months with the regulation in order to have the rates changed and to have it changed by January 1st to take effect for the full fiscal year. This was requested from previous town council. In comparison, a rate increase, the 2% rate increase, residents in town of Koldale, their monthly electrical and natural gas bill combined will go up by about $2.54 per month. When looking at the franchise fee rates, there is a maximum allowed amount that is allowed to be charged under the Utility Exchange Commission. So electrical is 20%, to which the town of Koldale is currently at 13%. Natural gas, the max is 35%, to which town of Koldale is at 15%. So even looking at the comparisons here, you can see the town of Koldale is far below some of the comparison municipalities. For example, Taber is at the max at 20% for electricity and 20% for natural gas, where the city is at 27% for natural gas. I just found out a couple days ago that the city's internal rider charge is at 15% for electrical. So again, town of Koldale is lower currently on those rates to our comparable municipalities. With the revenue increase that we are projecting, again, this revenue does increase from an increase in rates as well as an increase in demand. So for 2021, we're anticipating approximately $750,000 of net revenue, which this will increase by about $200,000 next year to just over $950,000 combined. When we're considering a long-term strategy for the operating budget or options to fund various programs, town council doesn't always have to lean on property taxes. They can consider franchise fees as an alternative to that as well. So for 2023 and 2024, town council can consider this in the future, again, as an alternative or as a side-by-side with municipal tax rates, as however they see fit as a possible balancing there. Any kind of questions on the first part of this presentation?
Deputy Mayor Avery.
When you're working out franchise fees, are you working in our projected growth in our industrial and residential? Or
Correct.
projection?
Yeah, so what happens is Fortis and ATCO will send us what they project their total revenue will be for the year, and they consider that in your growth. And then we take the projections based on what they anticipate. So it's coming directly from the source.
Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. Further to Deputy Mayor's question, with franchise fees, could that be also considered an economic development benefit for interested parties moving to Koldale?
It's yeah, I think it would be no different essentially than property taxes, right? Because at the end of the day, there is a fee charged by the municipality to our ratepayers to fund the services and the capital needs of the municipality. So you could have franchise fees that are very high and municipal taxes that are low, or vice versa, right? So it's, I think commercial business moving to Koldale would consider both of those options. Okay, moving on to the next section here. So we're kind of getting to the meat and potatoes of this presentation, so the draft operating budget. So this is just kind of for council's reference. In the staff report, there was a lot of detailed information about various departments, associated budgets with them. Wanted to provide some context here of how the budgets are essentially shaped by department for the town of Koldale. So we do have each main department here, followed by some sub-departments when applicable. So this again is just to provide a little better picture when reviewing some of the supplementary data part of this presentation. So challenges for the operating budget. So again, nobody likes tax increases, nobody likes rate increases. What we do when we make our budget is try and be as reasonable as we can, and budgeting based on what we project our actual expenses to be. But often there's various challenges that we do face as a municipality to balance a budget. The number one being the Msr Operating Grant. So as we've kind of discussed with council before, total funding for this program for the town of Koldale decreased by about 200 grand last year, but this will be the first year that we are reflecting this into our budget. So as part of this draft budget that has been presented to council, the total budget deficit at the moment is about 150 grand, and we're losing 200 from the MSI operating grant. So with those additional funds, we would be able to essentially bring back a balanced budget to council. So again, this is kind of the number one issue that the town of Koldale will be facing as part of this budget. Second item being that we've talked about too is the policing costs. So currently Koldale is the only municipality in Canada with a population under 15,000 that is currently responsible for paying 100% of our RCMP policing costs. This is compared to the traditional 70-30 split between the municipality and federal level. So looking at the RCMP budget, officer costs of just over $1,532,000. If the town of Koldale was only paying 30% of that, that would yield a budget savings of $460,000. So again, that is a significant cost that ultimately, as part of this being a budget challenge, it's being borne onto the municipal ratepayer.
Kyle, just a quick question for you. So in this proposed budget, the retroactive pay to the RCMP, that's included in the budget if that goes through?
The retroactive pay, we've actually estimated that as a 2021 expense. So when we estimated that surplus of 325 grand for this year, we accrued that charge in for 2021, so we didn't have to consider that for this year's budget.
Thank you.
Another challenge is interest rate. So pre-COVID, the prime interest rate was 3.95%. It has been reduced by 1.5 points to 2.45. Town of Koldale is only allowed to invest in areas which our principal is guaranteed. So, it's not like the town of Koldale is going to go invest in the stock market or Bitcoin, but we're not allowed to anyway. So the reason this has such a big impact is a lot of our return on investments are tied to prime rates. So when this figure did reduce, we did see our operating budget reduce from approximately $330,000 in interest and investment revenue from 2019 to $200,000 as part of this budget. So as interest rates are expected to rise in the future, this challenge will kind of help offset in the future. But again, it's still one that we're currently facing. To kind of help offset this, though, we did take surplus funds from 2020 and allocate them to 2022 and 2023. So $110,000, $185,000. This is essentially taking our surplus and adding it to future years' budget, so we're not having a big increase in tax requests in future years. Again, kind of a mill rate stabilization. So this is a kind of a short-term fix, but depending how interest rates turn out with the economic ramifications of COVID-19, this could be a longer-term budget challenge for the town of Koldale. Municipal boring. So we did touch base briefly at the last budget session that boring rates from the Alberta Government Treasury Board, they are increasing for capital projects by approximately 0.5 to 0.75%. With interest rates increasing, that ultimately means any boring the town of Koldale does for capital projects will result in increased financing costs, and again, higher costs that will have to be borne by the municipal ratepayer. So we will see this when we discuss the funding for the lagoon coming up here as part of this presentation. And the last point I want to touch on that we're all kind of dealing as part of our as part of COVID is inflation rates. So this municipality is not immune to inflationary charges, increase in construction prices, material prices, as well as cost of living is going up, and that does have an impact on the operating budget. So essentially either that means certain costs must go up, or service level does decrease to maintain the current budget the way it is. What we do though to kind of mitigate this is we're always looking for ways to reduce these pressures, review existing contracts, supplies, and services to essentially ensure how we can ensure Koldale is getting the best bang for a buck. That means RFPing services, quoting everything out to make sure we're getting the lowest and best price to kind of reduce this risk of inflation as well. So those were kind of the challenges as part of this operating budget. Any questions from council on that before we proceed to the next section? Seeing none. So part of this draft operating budget, we are bringing forward to council a review of tax and utility rates. Again, this is a draft budget, so the figures in here are essentially draft at this point, so this can change based on further direction or guidance from council at this moment. So in regards to the utility rates, we do have a $4 million debenture as we touched based on at the capital presentation for the area lagoon project, as well as we do have added operational expenses, so one additional full-time staff member to help with the operations of this project. So the debenture we are proposing to town council can range between 10 and 20 years. The exact year that is chosen will be kind of dependent on debt servicing strategy. This will have an effect on the utility rate. So a 10-year debenture will require higher increase to utility rates to pay that off early versus a 20-year debenture, which you have outstanding longer and utility rate is not as high, but again, that does increase financing charges. The second thing, again, is the tax rate. So we do have a current budget deficit that we are looking to discuss with council a possible increase in tax rates to fund that. So in speaking about we're going to talk about the utility rates first. So what we've done here is just take a snapshot of the kind of the financing calculator for this. So, excuse me. Going from left to right here. First, we have a 10-year debenture followed by a 15 and a 20-year. We've included the 15-year debenture as the scenario in this budget, just to pick the middle ground. But again, that is up to for further discussion here. As the years increase on the term of the loan, you'll see at the top here that the interest rate also does increase. You know, we're at 2.78 now for 10 years versus 3.5 for 20 years. The associated effect is that the financing costs for a loan will increase the longer we go out for a debenture. 17% for a 10-year loan, 28% for a 15-year loan, and 40% for a 20-year loan. So total financing cost for a 10-year debenture of $4 million is $673,000. Just moving up to 15 years, that does add approximately $437,000 to the overall servicing cost of the debenture. Again, that's just added interest by increasing the term of the loan. In order to kind of mitigate the rate increase as best we can for the ratepayer, what we've done is propose a funding structure over 2 years. So half the increase would happen in year 1 and the other half would happen in year 2. So we'll just pick on, say, the 15-year because that's the one we have in the scenario here. The total monthly increase per resident would be approximately $10.70 required to fund this debenture. What we're proposing for either option, either term here, is splitting that over 2 years. So the first year, residents would see an average increase of $5.35 increase on the monthly monthly utility bill. The second year, that same utility bill would increase by another $5.35. Following those 2 years, the debenture would essentially be serviced without any further increase. Now you can kind of see here the different charges and rates month by month based on the term of the debenture. So it is higher for a 10-year loan. But again, you're paying your debt off sooner, and you do have significantly less financing costs versus a 20-year where the increase is lower, but it will take you longer to pay that loan off, and you do have significantly higher financing costs. I'm just going to pause there if there's any discussion or questions from council on this.
Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. The financing costs, are they not locked in? I'm just curious as to, you know, this, if we're doing it over a 10-year or 15 years, say, for example, that you've got there, would they not be locked in?
The financing costs would be locked in. It's just the longer the term of the debenture, the higher the rate. The longer you have the loan outstanding, the more interest you're paying. So this is locked. The rate is locked in over the term of the debenture. Just the longer you go, the more interest you're paying. No difference if you have a 20-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage on your house, right?
Yes, go ahead. While we're waiting for Kyle, Kaylin, can you maybe just chat a little bit about, and Kyle can jump in when he gets back, about like the long-term budget with that new reservoir that we have to build and when that's going to come on stream, and to pay off this debenture quicker, this $4 million one from the sewer lagoon upgrades. Can you explain for council the benefit of going with the 10-year term versus the 15 or the 20?
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. Excellent question. Our CFO did a great job explaining the difference from a finance perspective on the 3 different loan options. Another important consideration for council is to look at its capital requirements over a 10-year period in addition to what the cost is. If you pay the loan off quicker in the 10-year scenario, you free up cash and debt capacity for other pieces of critical infrastructure that are going to be due in the next 5 to 10 years. In the case of our potable water reservoir, that is in our infrastructure master plan in that 5 to 10 year window. So by paying off the loan quicker, in 10 years from now, another major piece of critical infrastructure, that potable water reservoir, it'll be due for an expense. And so basically, you get this one over and done with quicker, you're better positioned to absorb another similar size loan for another piece of infrastructure without having to pay both at the same time. So if you go with the 15 or the 20, although it is cheaper in the short term, it could be more expensive for ratepayers if you have to tack on another major loan for a different piece of infrastructure at the same time. So if you want to look from like a finance asset management strategy, that is another important consideration, is what else is on the docket or coming down the pipe.
And then if we go with the 10-year debenture, then it goes from $5.35 to $6.97 for year 1. Gonna live, Kyle? Okay. Oh, Deputy Mayor Avery's got a question.
So can you explain how was this debenture originally going to be paid for when previous council okayed the $4 million debenture? Now that, 3 months later, we're now looking at how we're going to be paying for this. Wasn't that something that was discussed in previous term?
The intention of it when we passed the budget was it would always be a utility rate increase. However, there was some uncertainty of what the actual cost of the project was going to be once we were waiting for tender results and all that stuff. So we didn't know if it was going to be a $2 million debenture or $6 million at the time.
And our CFO's response to Deputy Mayor Avery, the details of the loan weren't specified, including the length of term. The decision to borrow the amount, that was determined by the time that the debenture came in. But in terms of how long it gets amortized for and at what rate, those details weren't locked in.
So part of the draft operating budget, we do have a current funding required for each year. So this does show the estimated tax increase that would have to happen year over year, just based on the current draft operating budget. So council doesn't have to formally approve any tax increase for future years. But again, this just kind of shows where the financial pictures for the town of Koldale based on this current draft budget here. So following this, we do have the capital request for the various departments that we're going to go through. Again, all of these have been included in the draft budget. That council can either say yes or no to these. Some of the projects are being funded through reserves, which are essentially the town savings account. Some are essentially funded through tax support, so these are through the town's checking account. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of turn it over to Kaylin first to maybe talk about this records management part for me.
All right, thank you, Kyle. As council will recall, when we did our legislative services departmental orientation that was led by Lana Anthony, our legislative coordinator, an update was provided on the records management project that we're working on here in the town, where it systemizes and organizes the files that we have into an intelligible format that makes it easy to find information in the future. And that involves a lot of legwork to make sense of the various files that we've had historically saved randomly under different styles based on the preference of the employee at the time. And so when you want to look for pieces of information 5-10 years later, and that individual's not there, it's difficult to figure out what type of system that they use to save different files that you're looking for. This consolidates it into more of a scientific formula that we hired a consultant to assist us with. And one of the infrastructure pieces that we acquired to facilitate this was the acquisition of Microsoft Sharepoint. So far, corporate services has been our guinea pig department, where we employed the new taxonomy schedule for their files, and the intent is to expand that to all of the other municipal departments. And in order to do that, that comes at an estimated cost of $40,000 for 2022, and that would be funded through the general operating reserve. That is going to fund the technology as well as the consultant's time who's going to work with us to ensure that we sift through the documents and code them correctly so that we can continue to get more organized as an organization. Does that follow, or is there any other information required for that particular item?
Thank you. Just so we're clear, that $40,000, that's a one-time, right? That's not a recurring every year?
That's correct.
Okay.
The next item under the administrative heading here, this is actually addressed with council on Monday by Lana Antony, the ability to add the video timestamp module of our iCompass agenda software. You look up an item and it pulls up that particular portion of the meeting at the same time that you pull up the document. So you can actually hear the council meeting and what happened while you're looking at the document. City of Lethbridge is the most recent example of where this is being done. It's really handy if you're trying to look at what exactly happened with respect to that agenda item. This comes at a cost of $6,500 for the first year, and then from there subsequent it'd be $47.50 on an ongoing basis. And then from there, I think we're positioned to bring in our fire chief for the emergency services items.
Welcome, Chief. The floor is yours.
Good evening, Mayor Van Ryan and Council. So emergency services, we have a couple slides that I'll go through. First one up on the screen here is the concrete swale. So we are looking to place a metal grate over top of this swale just due to the depth of it that is causing some issues for our apparatus and vehicles to be driving over top of it. So it's adding a little bit of wear and tear as well as a bit of a safety hazard for our staff who are riding bikes coming to the fire hall, trying to get over that. So we did identify this during the fire hall construction and looked at doing it through the contractor that way, but to save some money to avoid the surcharges of additional change orders, we determined we'd have a look at it later after the fire hall was complete. So we had our engineering department look into it, reach out to a couple places and get a quote and a design. So the total budgeted cost for this would be $20,000, which would be a one-time cost to put that grading over top of the swale. Okay. Next thing is just to kind of expand on the highly successful Kate Andrews Fire and Emergency Services Academy. we're looking at implementing a summer work experience program where we can actually bring in students from the program to work at the fire hall with us during the week from about June to August. And we would look at 2 students just to share some of that opportunity with several of the students. We're looking at $6,000 in funds to go towards this annual program if council approves. Some great benefits to this, just experience for the students working along the firefighters and paramedics that we have on staff and gaining valuable experience. And hopefully excite them a little bit more about pursuing a career in emergency services. Palliser Regional School Division is also looking at grant opportunities if there is any available through provincial and federal funding sources, and so maybe they will be able to subsidize some of that cost as well to help out with that program. Okay, the next part is to do with our Community Peace Officer program. So with the recent changes that the government of Alberta is implementing, where all the photo radar tickets, bylaw ticketing, and roadside enforcement will be going through an e-ticketing system, that there is a cost of $10,000, which would be an annual cost to run the e-ticketing software and program in the Community Peace Officer vehicles. So this is a requirement coming down from the province that is going to be live or coming into effect February 1st of 2022. The next part is, again, with the CPO program, looking at changing who they use for dispatch. So right now they use PRCC in Edmonton, which is a very, very basic service where they can check in and let them know they're going on a call or doing a traffic stop. But to improve officer safety, along with some other benefits such as interagency collaboration and some interoperability with the regional CPOs, such as Ridge Regional, MD of Tabor, and Lethbridge County. They are all dispatched through the Tabor Police Dispatch Center. So getting on board with them would bring a lot of benefits and additional officer safety, where if there was an issue at a traffic stop, now there's someone staffed 24/7 at the other end of that radio and can quickly dispatch additional resources such as other CPOs in the area or RCMP if one of our CPOs required assistance. And yep, the cost on that, again, is an annual fee of $10,000. Final item for emergency services, looking at a fire master plan. So we would look at bringing in a external consulting firm to work with our department, planning and development and infrastructure, to kind of take a collaborative and integrated approach to emergency services planning within the town of Koldale. So one thing, kind of our current situation is we have a lot of growth within the town of Koldale, and we need to be able to balance the needs of a rapidly growing community with the need to provide reliable and effective emergency services, while the new town development conforms to the National Building Code Alberta edition. So we haven't officially had a fire master plan done in the town of Koldale before. We've been part of several other studies, where the town of Koldale was kind of a small part in a study that was led by Lethbridge County. So that last one was way back in 2001. So with our growth, there's a variety of solutions and different options for the town to look at. So ideally, the fire master plan will help determine cost benefits of those solutions, propose alternative solutions, conduct a risk assessment of the town and our primary response area in the county, give us some information and direct us on trigger points for actionable items such as staffing, equipment, and or additional facilities. Also review our current fire department operations and guide the town of Koldale Fire Services for the next 15 years, kind of through this annexation period as we see development. So we are estimating a cost of $50,000, which would be a one-time fee for this type of study. And that's it.
Any questions for the chief? Go ahead, Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn, and through the chief, thank you so much for your presentation and report tonight. I wanted to just simply ask you a question about the two $10,000 requests here, which you're asking for tax support. Would the e-ticketing system for bylaw, could that not be taken from our photo radar as an example? The other one with dispatch, I'm sure that might need tax support, but I just wondered if the 10,000 could come through your funding through the through photo radar.
So to kind of answer your question there, and thank you, Councillor Reese and Chapman, for the aid. It was appreciated. What we do for the photo radar revenue is we budget what we anticipate that's going to be as part of the overall budget. That does fund basically our bylaw department. This is an added expense over and above like previous year's budget on top of that. So the photo radar revenue does go into the bylaw department. We have the expenses for it. This is just an added expense to the bylaw department. So when we say tax support, it's essentially, once you have all the revenues and all the expenses, the balance left over that needs to be funded through taxes. So even though some of these costs are, funded through photo radar and whatnot, we don't specifically split like this is funded by photo radar or this is funded by taxes. But that's kind of included in the entire piece of the overall budget, if that answers your question.
I would just recommend that the bylaw department review that for next budget season, and whether that can be something that can be taken from within that department, being that the e-ticketing would be both for photo radar and for traffic. Am I correct on that? So that's kind of like almost an in-out.
Well, essentially though, if we're not gaining $10,000 extra photo radar revenue, so we do budget, based on what we're going to expect. This is just an added expense over and above our expenses to run it. So while the photo radar does kind of run it and pay for it, this doesn't mean we're going to get additional funds from photo radar to fund it, right? So we still have to fund it somehow. So hopefully that kind of clarifies it.
I just have a quick follow-up question to Councillor Chapman, and then it's your turn, Jordan. So who determines the price of the photo radar tickets? Is that that's provincial?
Yeah, that's set by the provincial government. They have a number of regulations and whatnot that we have to follow by. So we don't have control over setting the price for that.
Thank you. Councillor Saylor.
So it says $10,000 in order to maintain the photo radar program. Are we making enough money from the photo radar program that it's worth keeping it? Like, can we just not pay the $10,000 and not do photo radar? Or does photo radar produce enough income for us that it is worth to pay the $10,000 extra a year?
It is worth, it is a big revenue source to help fund the bylaw department. So between photo radar and the traffic fines that the RCMP hand out, that total revenue is approximately $500,000 a year in this budget. So it does go a long way to funding, the bylaw department and part of the RCMP expenses as well.
Deputy Mayor Avery got a question.
Mayor Van Ryn, and I know my wife has contributed to the photo radar considerably here in the last little while. So, so why can't we take the $10,000 out of the profit, reduce the grant monies that we're giving out? Because there should be a way, because if there's profit in it and we're giving profit away, there should be a way to take that profit to pay for this, so we don't have to increase, you know, there's got to be a way. It's all tax dollars, right? So there's only one taxpayer, and whether we're giving you a photo radar ticket or putting it on your tax bill or your utility bill. So can't we just take it from the profit?
Yeah, kind of maybe explain it this way. Think of that all the town's budget is kind of one big pot. So when we look at the bylaw department individually, you know, we do budget for the photo radar revenue coming in and then all the expenses. So this is included in here, right? And then to determine the total amount we need to budget or to fund the town of Koldale, we take all the departments and add them together to get that total number. So the reason this is specifically being brought up, because it essentially is funded through photo radar, but it is a new request that if we took this expense out, for example, we took this 10 grand out, our photo radar revenue is still the same regardless, like if we didn't have to do this change. So now we just have an added $10,000 expense that we don't have any more revenue for. So while the photo radar does pay for it, if you think of it as one big kind of pot of money overall, we're still getting to that net budget deficit of 151 grand. So on this presentation, or as part of this, we could say, yes, this is paid by photo radar, but we would still have the same budget deficit of 150 grand, if that makes sense.
Kalen's got a question.
Mr. Mayor, just a quick follow-up, like in response to Deputy Mayor Avery's question, you could exchange one expense for another to neutralize the impact on the budget. So for instance, if council wished, they could reduce the expense associated with the photo radar grant program, equivalent to the cost of this new expense to neutral it out.
You could do that, yeah. What I'm kind of thinking, the feeling is that the way with Councillor Chapman and Deputy Avery, is it, you know, it's looking like we're asking for more tax dollars to fund this, but I understand, you know, it is paid through photo radar, but just looking at the grand scheme, but you're correct. Like if you want to neutralize it, you could just reduce another expense, like the safety grant or the photo radar grant as well.
Follow up then to that is that the community grant program, which we fund from photo radar, is still a moving target. It's based on your accumulated number. I guess I'm going to use that word rather than revenue per annum. So, you know, that's a fluctuating moving target. So if you deduct $10,000 from that overall thing, the reason being is that we have no wiggle room from here. This is a mandatory cost that we as a town have to take on. So we can't get out of this one.
And to kind of your point there, you're correct. That was kind of the historical way that this has been gone. About two and a half years ago, when we discussed the photo radar with council, there was some uncertainties as, you know, what was the exact profit from the photo radar, because it is mixed in with the RCMP. So for the grant program, we've just set that as a straight flat amount for the past couple of years. That's set at $35,000 a year, and that's been just for the past 2 years. But you're correct; that was the historical context before that.
Yeah, I have a question for the chief regarding the fire master plan. So that's based on the future expansion of West Koldale and Northwest Koldale, correct?
That's correct.
So with the area structure plans that are yet to be, need to be developed for that, and the timelines involved with that, and our CAO can jump in on this as well, is that something that needs to be done in 2022, or is that something that we can put some money aside and then deal with this in 2023? Or does this need to be done before the area structure plan is done so that they know where to put another fire station or where they need to put hydrants and such?
Thank you for the question, Mayor. I believe the earlier we get started, the better. With several developers already looking at land in and around Koldale, I think the better we can prepare ourselves for what's coming down the pipe, the better. For that, I think it would be great to get started on this in 2022. The entire pot of money isn't available. There is another option of just perhaps skimming the scope down of the plan, just to look directly at a couple issues, which the biggest issue would be emergency response outside of our 10-minute response zone, which has a direct impact on how those new developments are going to be able to be built.
Deputy Mayor Avery.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. So, speaking and furthering what Mayor Van Ryn was saying, can't we work with the developers that want to develop? And if they're not willing to build sprinklered homes and don't want the glazed openings and don't want the larger lots, what are they willing to put into this in the development? Are they willing to put a firehouse in the northwest for a quicker response? Like, this is a development, not a, as we grow. So I think we need to work with our developers rather than a master plan.
Kalen's got a comment.
Thank you, Mayor, and excellent discussion. Like, my assessment is that it would be helpful to have the data that would be provided from an exercise like this, and it coincides well with our off-site levy review bylaw process, where if you have good information, then you can justify cost sharing for any type of infrastructure upgrades that may be needed in respect to fire services as a result of development in these newly annexed areas. So you're spending a little bit of money to get the information that'll be required to justify capital cost-sharing partnerships with those developers, because you don't want to have the taxpayers, the existing taxpayers in the existing part of Koldale to have to subsidize the new infrastructure costs associated with for-profit development and the newly annexed part of town. So we can look at the scope, but I really think it's important and timely to get the intel that we need so that we can be helpful at the planning stage, at the area structure planning stage, when they're going to be looking at densities, spacing, and the whole design of the development. So,
Okay, thank you. That clarifies it.
Just as a follow-up, so I'm fairly versed at it, Kalen. I've sat at other council tables and explained that it's not the fire department's issue, it's the developer's issue. We always throw this Alberta Building Code in, which again I'm fairly versed in, and Alberta Fire Code, which I'm fairly versed in, out all the time, but it's not. And when you bring in a consultant, you lay down the scope of what you want them to do, and then you have to bring in municipal affairs to our table and explain why or why not we have to do this. So just be careful with the scope that you lay out if you're going to do a fire master plan. I know other municipalities around us have done them, and they're not the expected outcome.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryn. Very intrigued by your concepts, Deputy Mayor, and my thoughts are this, and that is that I anticipate that development will occur quite quickly. Would it not be appropriate or helpful for our administration to have a clear vision of what has to take place so that when developers do come to the table, they understand that there is a mandatory requirement for A, B, or C, and these are the costs that would be associated with it. So if a 10-minute response time is going to be the deal breaker or the deal maker, then we should have that criterion and advance notice up front so that when people come to the table, we already are prepared, understanding that there might be some other moving parts, but I think at this point in time, it might be helpful to have a clear idea as to how we're moving forward as a town. 9,000 population. I don't know what the next 4 years will bring, but I think it'll happen much more quickly than later.
Any follow-up to that, Deputy Mayor?
Again, I know we need to work with the developers. I know a municipality where they helped move the fire station to the middle of town rather than the east end of town to get it closer for that 10-minute response time. So, which is not something we'd be looking at, but they might be, developers might be looking at helping with a substation.
So just to be clear in my little brain, then, this needs to be done at some point. It's just a matter of who's going to pay for it, whether we pass that on to the developers through the off-site levies. Okay. Go ahead, Kayla.
Just one other quick comment. We are exploring the potential of using grant dollars to do this through the provincial government, and in particular the ACP program, the Alberta Collaboration Program. I forget what the acronym stands for. I use it so much. Sorry? I think it's Community Partnership. Community Partnership grant. So we are looking at other ways to pay for it, and we can recoup these costs from developers later, but this may likely, just to get the ball rolling, be an expense we have to kickstart.
Okay, maybe just through to the mayor.
Just 1 sec. Councillor Beekman had a comment or a question.
Yeah, thank you. Just to the chief, hypothetically, let's say that funding was approved and everything to start January 2022. What would your timeline be to completion of the fire master plan?
Through the chair to Councillor Beekman, thank you for the question. Ultimately, the goal would be completion within 2022. These things definitely take some time, a lot of moving pieces to this one, I think, potentially. So I would say by the fall of 2022, ideally would be a completion for the project such as this.
Councillor Chapman.
Mayor, and maybe just, and to the mayor, my thought is this, that the $50,000 study would be paid for by the town, but that if they do require a fire hall, that would be covered through off-site levies? Is that how I see the picture in general? Okay, so there's two different items here, one being the cost to the town for the 50,000, and then the off-site levies would cover the actual building and site.
Okay. Kaylin had a comment.
That's exactly correct. And just one other point of note, it's helpful to have good data so that we can justify capital expenses that get downloaded to the developer, because they can appeal off-site levy charges to the province if they don't think it's justified. So it's important that we arm ourselves with good data to justify those expenses that they would have to incur, yeah.
Councillor Pickering, you had a comment?
Yeah, my question is, was this, like now that we're building that new rec center and school over there, which is completed in 2024, was that taken into account, this 10-minute response time? And what's going to be over there to, if there is a fire? As of right now, there's no hydrants, no services.
Through the chair to Councillor Pickering, thanks for the question. The school itself doesn't fall within the requirement for that. It can be built to essentially any design that it wants to because of the type of construction the school is, and it's fully sprinklered. There will be hydrants in place before occupancy of that school, so there will be water supply and fire flow available over there. We did a fair bit of kind of looking at different response routes and plans and how long it would take when we had the large report presented to council. And it was just under 10 minutes, it looked like, for us to get over there. So this the school sits a little bit outside of the 10-minute response issue that we have, and that's primarily focused for residential development in that northwest area and southwest, I guess.
And just clarification, 10 minutes, that includes the shoot time as well.
That's right. So in the building code itself, they consider the 10 minutes the time 911 receives the call. So the time fire department gets dispatched, assembled, and arrives at the scene of the fire with an apparatus that's has the capability to fight a fire. So it has to be a fire engine with water on. So for us, and that's got to be, you got to be able to make it there 90% of the time. So during the day, no issues, right? We have staff at the hall, but when our firefighters are at home at night, we typically have about a 6-minute shoot time. So if you consider a minute and a half for 911 to get the call to tone us out, 6 minutes to get there, you're really only looking at a 10-minute response time of about 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes of actual drive time. Right, so it's kind of a small area. We do have that area defined right now, and it is a layer within our GIS. So our planning and development engineering people have access to that. So when we are looking at plans and developments, it's very easy for them to pull that up. And if there is development now in that area, all our building code people just need to know that that house is outside of the 10-minute area, therefore has to be built to code.
Okay. Last chance for questions for the chief. Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. So just for clarity for Councillor Pickering, so that, as Chief said, is just for residential, a school, a rec center, they don't, this was all driven from high-intensity residential fires, and that's why they put the 10-minute response in and changed the building code back in 2012, I believe it was, because of all the big fires in Calgary and Edmonton where they were spreading from house to house to house. And so when we look at industrial, that depends on the occupancy. So this was just purely residential responses.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chief.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on to operations. Justin?
Good evening, Council. I'm here to discuss a few items, just the changes for this year. I'm going to start with the curb stop replacement program. It's $10,000. We currently do not have a program in place. If a curb stop breaks, we actually just replace it within the budget that we have. This will allow us to identify curb stops throughout the year and then have them in a replacement schedule for next year. Additional funds for the establishment of an annual replacement program will help with the replacement of aging infrastructure. So the curb stops are what helps us, what enables us to turn off water to individual homes or businesses. If we find a broken one, we put it on a list to replace kind of as soon as possible, because in the case of any renovations happening, we do get a lot of phone calls like that where someone say, I would like to replace that water valve. Can you come turn off my curb stop? If we can't at that point, we'll replace it. Things like that. The next one is the alley replacement program. This is something we have done in the past. We didn't do it this last year. It worked quite well. We're asking for $75,000. That lets us replace about 5 alleys each year, and we're asking that for yearly from now on. This will just help us get ahead of those alley complaints. The replacement of the alleys, we do currently have a grading and maintenance program where we grade all the alleys each year, sometimes 2 a year, depending on the severity of the alleys. This will allow us to actually physically replace them. So what we do is depending on the material that's left, we go down about 4 to 6 inches, cut out all the waste material, and bring in proper gravel and grade the alleys to a certain spec to allow drainage.
I'll just add to
Justin,
that.
how do you determine which alleys need to be done?
Are you gonna add? There's a few ways we determine that. One of the ways is we do an alley assessment each year while they're grading it. The grader operator takes toll of which ones are in the worst condition. That's probably the easiest point because he can actually feel it in the blade and the feedback of the grader, how much life is left in that alley, and a lot of the time there's not much left. That's one way. Every time it rains, it's pretty easy to identify which ones need to be replaced because we send out our crews to either pump or quickly add some gravel in spots that are really low that are causing issues. And then we also take complaints into consideration. If a resident calls and says that this area is really bad this time of year, we'll actually go out and identify that, inspect it, and then we keep a list based off priorities by those identifiers.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, sorry I cut you off there.
No worries. I just add here that the funds are requested from reserves, but part of the kind of our asset management is, we're looking to implement this program. We're not looking to ask for additional $75,000 from the taxpayer today, from tax dollars, but the future goal over, budget years in the future would be to eventually turn this program into funding from our tax base, essentially our checkings account and not our reserves or savings account. Just a budget note on that.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor Van Ryan, and through to Justin, thank you so much for all your hard work on all these projects. My only question to you with regards to the alleys would be the alleys that probably get the most severity of damage, I guess, or abuses, the ones that get the back alley pickups. I would suspect that they would be the worst, so that would be more annual, almost more regular than some others that have front street pickup.
Yeah, that's correct. We also take in consideration traffic, just general traffic. For example, the alleys behind Main Street see quite a bit more traffic than an alley, and that only services 2 or 3 houses. So, next is the Cottonwood Storm Pond.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Deputy.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. So why can't we look at paving the more frequently used alleys? So when I was out campaigning this time, it was brought up to me several times if we did adopt an alley. So the town takes out the debenture and then we pay for it over the next 10 years like we're doing with the sewer lagoon. So why can't we try and propose that with some public engagement, see if there's interest of doing the adopt an alley program?
Paving alleys is something we've discussed quite a few times in the town of Koldale, and it's something that other municipalities do. There's quite a few things to consider here. Mainly cost is the first one. For example, Lethbridge has a program that allows, it's a local improvement tax, I believe, that's put onto that block, so the block has a vote. Say if I think it's 70% of that block votes yes, we want a paved alley, City of Lethbridge will come and pave that alley. One of the things that holds us back here from starting a program like that is storm drainage. Once you start paving an alley, you have to have storm drainage in that alley because that water, asphalt's going to shed water substantially faster than gravel, and it doesn't soak any water up. That water needs a place to go. And then the core of the town, where a lot of the non-paved alleys are, that is a primary issue. We already don't have storm drainage in that area, so that is something that could be considered in the future. It would just need it's quite larger conversation.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Kalen?
And just one new point, that is the new specification for all new development in town. We don't, paved alley is a requirement, but trying to, as our Director of Operations mentioned, existing parts of town are a little bit tricky just because it's the hand you're dealt.
Councillor Pickering.
So does that mean if you have storm drainage in your back alley, we could apply for that?
We don't have a program in place right now. That's something we could consider. Adding storm, it's not just having storm drainage available, it's having capacity as well for the water that's coming in. So that's something we'd have to work with our infrastructure team to identify to make sure we actually have the capacity of storage before we can release.
Ultimately, too, this is kind of a newer concept too that we're discussing. So if it is something that council wants a little more exploratory information on and looking into, the Adopt the Alley program, if it is, if you have the drainage requirements met and you want to pay for it as a block and you pay for it as a local improvement, that's something that we can explore during the next year and present information to council and how that possible public engagement or costing would work too. So it's not something that we can do today or start doing tomorrow, but it doesn't mean it's something we can't start thinking about and putting into the future if that's council's wishes.
Okay, continue, please.
Okay, let's talk about some Cottonwood storm pond dredging. This is a one-time project. This pond was identified last year as needing this kind of desperately. Quite a bit of buildup in the bottom of this pond. Also, the sides are sloughing, so our plan is to have it dredged, clean up the sides, and re-rip wrap it so it will last quite a bit longer this time. This will give us more storm pond capacity for this one.
What kind of damage is that going to do to the existing pathways?
It should do no damage to the existing pathways. We should be able to go in there and bring a hi-ho in there, dig out that storm pond, and then leave it in the condition. We're not increasing the footprint, we're just dredging that actual pond, so.
So how do you get to the pond then? Is there an access to it?
If we have to go across pathways, we can have rig mats
Okay.
installed.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I'll just kind of speak on the fire hydrant replacement program. This is more of a kind of a finance thing. So the town currently does have a fire hydrant replacement program in place. With these funds, we replace about 5 a year. This was previously funded through our reserves, so essentially, again, the savings account. But what we're looking to do is get off funding these annual programs through our reserves and put it more onto the, again, the checkings account here, kind of the tax base. So while this isn't a new request for a program, we're essentially putting $48,000 more into our savings account every year by not having to use those funds to pay for it. So without this request here, there would essentially be a $50,000 or $48,000 less request. But again, this is to essentially help build up our reserves and not fund our reserves with these, or not use our reserves to fund these annual maintenance programs.
Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Mayor. Through to Kyle, with this yearly replacement program, then, so next year you won't be coming to council asking for $48,000 or percentage of increase or anything like that. It'll be an annual, forever, perpetuity, regular program.
Correct.
Right, thank you.
If I could just add to that, it may increase over time depending on our asset management. The more fire hydrants we have, the more we will be replacing per year. So fire hydrants have a 25-year life expectancy, so we average that out and say we need to replace this many hydrants a year to meet that 25-year life expectancy. So at some point we may come back and say we need to increase this based on how many hydrants there are.
So in the past, we've spent about this amount of money, if I'm right?
Yes,
then
yeah.
for replacement, so, okay.
Any further questions on operations for Justin?
No, we're good to go on to engineering.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So we kind of touched about this at the capital budget presentation as well. So one of the future needs is the water reservoir. As identified in the IMP, the current water reservoir does lack the capacity to respond to Koldale's future growth and development. So this isn't anything related to the actual construction of the water reservoir, but then this is a fairly significant milestone and project for Koldale's future infrastructure. So what we're just looking for is $50,000 to start a study on this, which will identify, what's exactly needed for capacity for the water reservoir, what's the cost going to be, what's the best location, as well as potential grants that could help assist with this. So again, starting this program earlier will help increase Koldale's success in possibly achieving those one-time grants that we discussed at the last budget meeting, if available. Next one here is just kind of a, council did previously discuss this item, the West Koldale Transportation Study, $50,000. This was discussed at the November 8th council meeting. But again, with this kind of being a one-time project and funded through reserves, we just wanted to point this out to council, again, kind of an FYI. Any kind of questions on the engineering studies?
Just on the West Koldale, this will take into Highway 3 corridor with the future pedestrian paths, looking at that, or the grade level crossings, or?
I will refer that to CAO Hastings.
Okay. Thank you. You're going to be doing planning and development, Kyle? Okay.
ask a question through to CAO Hastings on that water reservoir. Outside of the study, if once the infrastructure goes up, would that be part of off-site levies at any point?
Yes, that's correct. Off-site levies will be one of the primary funding sources for that capital infrastructure because it's largely being triggered by the new growth as a result of annexation.
Welcome, Spencer. The floor is yours.
Let's see. I don't know who's controlling the presentation. Is it Kyle? Okay. All right, so we'll start with the first item here, which is Main Street supplies. And as you'll see on the screen, it's a request for the budget for 2022 and beyond to be set at $10,000 for supplies associated with the Main Street area. The reason that this is worth consideration is that having just spent $3.5 million on the public portions of the Main Street, which was largely related to infrastructure, a very small amount of which was related to street level improvements. And the ongoing revitalization efforts in the Main Street area, it's been identified that it would be worthwhile to have a small amount of funding available year over year to be able to purchase things that would continue to enhance that area. So things such as tables and chairs for daily use and for special events, temporary patio supplies, materials for special events and activities such as wind and shade covers, and the replacement and enhancement of features that are already in place such as the wayfinding signage.
Was this discussed at all with the business owners along Main Street to see if they wanted to contribute anything towards that?
There hasn't been a discussion detailing whether they would contribute to funding yet. Typically in that kind of model, it would not require, but typically be associated with a business revitalization zone or something a little bit more formal than the working group that we're standing up this year.
So if there was tables and chairs, they would be for the general public, they wouldn't be for a specific business then?
They could be. So by way of example, some other communities that have a similar funding model for their downtowns would use that funding for the purchase of tables and chairs for the bulb outs or the curb extensions so that people can sit and enjoy coffee or ice cream or whatever during the summers. The same supplies could also be used for special events like farmers markets. And so they're kind of multi-purpose items that would be purchased. And then in addition to that, places like the City of Lethbridge, for instance, fully fund the temporary patios that are constructed and rented to businesses year over year during the summer months.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so next we have the intermunicipal development plan with a total budget request of $15,000, and that's because in discussion with the county that represents approximately half of the upper limit of a full refresh on the current intermunicipal plan. Just as a bit of background, that plan was last updated in 2020, but only in a very minor way to account for changes that occurred as a result of the annexation. Prior to that, the last major update was 2010. So in speaking with the county and looking at why we would want to do this in 2022, some of the reasons would be that it would be representative of a full refresh of the preamble policies and general guidance of that intermunicipal plan. It would be a way of undertaking a major check-in with all stakeholders, so town and county property owners, businesses, partner organizations such as SMRID, and of course the town and county councils as well. So this would result in a plan aligned with the values, needs, and wants of today's stakeholders versus one that's over a decade old now.
Okay, thank you.
And we just have some imagery showing the change in the jurisdiction of the IDP boundary. This would likely stay the same, and it's actually shrunk since 2010, but that's a result in part of the annexation that was recently undertaken. So lastly, we have the North Koldale Industrial Area Structure Plan. This was touched on in Monday's meeting as well, so I'll keep my comments as brief as I can. The general idea here is that we're recommending we take the opportunity to plan for continued industrial growth in conjunction with work that's already going on in a portion of the area we're going to be discussing tonight. that represents about half of the quarter section in question. So this would be beneficial to ensure that we can plan proactively for continued industrial growth, because we do have strong growth to the point where we're now effectively out of land that we can provide for industrial growth in our own area in the town industrial park. Okay, so the image on the screen just represents our existing industrial area, and then to the west there are 6 properties associated with that quarter section, one of which in the middle is about 85 acres, give or take, and is being planned by a private development group. The other 5 properties are adjacent to or near to that area, and if we didn't take this opportunity to plan out those areas as well, we're effectively creating additional complexity and cost with other ad hoc ways of trying to address how those areas would relate to the private development group's area as they plan that out. Next slide. So in terms of how this would work, the 5 properties would be, the cost for the planning of those 5 additional properties would be covered by the town initially, with the costs associated with additional planning for those properties coming back to the town later on as they subdivide and develop in the future.
Any questions for Spencer before he takes off for the evening?
No, we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll just kind of start on Parks and Recreation, just till Russ Tanner gets out here. So the first request here is 1 additional staff member. So the green space currently maintained by Town of Koldale has slowly increased over the past number of years. So current stats here, the town does have 120 acres of manicured green space. They do have 8 playground structures and 10 playground structures and 8 sport courts that the parks staff does also maintain. So the additional staff member would be requested to provide additional resources to the town's Parks and Rec department to keep up with increasing demands from the parks. This position would be a split, so it would essentially be parks through the first kind of the summer months and recreation through the winter months here. So if this is approved by council, the cost would be offset through the reduction of 1 seasonal recreation worker as well. That seasonal recreation worker would just be kind of replaced by this new full-time park staff here. Total cost for this is $55,000. Russ, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Any questions from council on this item?
Nope.
No.
Oh, Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a question through to Russ, if I may. Horticulturalist, is that part of the Rec and Parks Department? Having a horticulturist or arborist, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yes, Councillor Chapman, we currently have an arborist on staff that works with the parks construction team. His name is Ryan. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so further to this, we've got 2 other items on the for the Parks and Recreation Department. Pathways and Trails Maintenance Program at $5,000 yearly. With the expansion of pathways recently, the trails throughout the town of Koldale over the past number of years, an annual maintenance program would help maintain them. What we're mainly looking at, a lot of this, the funding that we're speaking specifically to here would be like crack seal maintenance, things like that, so that the seasonal freeze and thaw would not continue to deteriorate the pathway and it would keep it in a better working order from year to year. So that would be that first item. You want me to stop there for now? Okay, and then the next one would be the mountain bike park. As you guys are aware, this past year in September we opened up the new mountain bike park. It's been well received from the community, and this would be looking after the supplies needed and the maintenance needed on an annual basis to keep it in good working condition.
Any questions for Russ on Parks and Recreation? Okay, thanks, Russ. All right. So the last item I'll kind of talk about here is library. So the library is kind of requesting budget carryover. So this was previously approved by the last town council. It was $10,000 to, if you kind of look at the picture, they're essentially enclose that area with a plexiglass and a door, so it can provide a little more flexibility, a little more privacy for those using the room. With this being a carryover and a fund from reserved, we did want to send this to council for their approval as well. So definitely not the library expert, but I can answer any questions if there's anything on this program.
No, we're good.
Seeing none, we'll just kind of conclude the operating budget presentation here. So kind of a few questions for council at this time. If there's any information in this report that we discussed or we did not discuss that council would like any information on, are there any budget requests or items that council would like to present to administration? And thirdly, if there's any follow-up questions from our last meeting on December 8th regarding the capital budget presentation.
Deputy Mayor Avery.
Question, so we're debenturing somebody's wage over 10 years, is that on the, so I'm going back to when we were talking about the sewer lagoon, and we got $75,000 in there for utility operator, so we're going to debenture that wage rather than putting it into our true operational?
So the wage won't be debentured. The wage will go into the operating budget, but the increase in utility rates will, one, pay for the financing costs on the debenture and the wage.
Thank you.
Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Mayor. Through to Kyle, just looking way down the budget summary, are you going through that later, or are we closing down?
The intention wasn't to go through the line-by-line budget summary, it was just to provide council reference. But if there are any questions, I can go through them if you wish.
Just more of a comment that FCSS approved a 3% increase to their requisitions for the coming year.
We did expect some type of increase, so we have factored that into the budget, just of note there as well. So just kind of go through the next steps here. So the final budget meeting that we have scheduled is for Monday, December 20th. Under the MGA, council must pass a 3-year operating plan and a 5-year capital plan before the end of the year. So we do have a couple options here. If council believes they have enough information to pass the operating capital budget for the year, we can present that to council and present that with any adjustments. If council would require further information or further time before passing a formal budget, we can pass an interim budget on the 20th and then have further budget deliberations in the new year, to which council can amend the budget.
Any questions for Kyle? Okay, we're good.
So just, if I may ask, as for the 20th meeting, would you, from council's wishes, just to bring back the budget we've presented and open that up for, again, possible discussions from council if we'd like to pass that or bring it to the new year? I'm just looking for how to structure the meeting for next one.
I think it'll be safe to bring the budget back. And then
Perfect.
we can
Thank you.
discuss it then.
With that being said, that's all I have for this presentation here.
Okay. Last chance for questions. Okay. Deputy Mayor.
I believe there's 2.5 positions that are in here. The wage numbers that are in there, are they prorated because you're not going to have somebody starting January 1st? Or are they, so are they 0.75 of what the true costs are, or?
So the utility position, based on the way we are budgeting it to fund it over 2 years, that position wouldn't start till July 1st. So that one has been prorated. The Parks and Recreation position, that one we would be looking to start posting in January. So that one hasn't been prorated at all. It could be prorated, knock a month or two off to, save a little bit there. But that one hasn't been prorated at all. And I believe there was just the 2 positions, unless I'm missing one.
And there was the summer students at the station.
Oh, that one has been prorated, so that's just a flat $6,000 for the year.
Councillor Saylor.
Yeah, that just made me think of something, because that said interns. Why do they need $6,000 if it's interns? Don't interns work for free?
I believe the intention is to, there would be 2 students hired, and they would be, intern may not be the best word, but they would essentially be summer students.
Idea, kind of.
Kind of like a, yeah, something like that. Right? They would just kind of work the 2 months in July and August.
Okay. If that's everything, then we'll close the open portion of the meeting, and at 7:07, we'll be going into closed meeting.
Mayor, I'll just make a motion to receive the administration's report for information.
Okay, and then I also need a motion to go into closed session.
So,
Councillor Saylor. And then Councillor Chapman receive the presentation as information. Okay, we'll do, pardon me, yeah, we'll do Councillor Chapman's motion first. All those in favor? Carried. And the motion to go into closed session by Councillor Saylor. All those in favor? Carried.
So part of the closed session